You'll be seeing that there's a notice at the top indicating that the transcription started. So we will be recording this presentation, and we make all of our presentations available on the New South Wales Statewide Biobank website. So people can also listen in to the presentation if you weren't able to attend today. So we'll just wait a couple more minutes and then we'll start. Thanks again.
Hi, Wendy, Becky, at the top of your team, can you see an icon that says request control?
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
Here we go. Request control, Wendy, it's center top. If you're able to access it, you'll be able to change the slides yourself. But if not, Brent's ready to go.
Yeah, no, along the top I've just got Microsoft Teams search and then the 3 dots and my university and name.
Okay, and that's fine. Brent will be listening to your command to change the slides.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so look, we might start. It is indeed a great pleasure and an honour to have Professor Wendy Rogers here with us today at the Statewide Biobank. So Professor Wendy Rogers, she's a distinguished professor at the Macquarie University, where she holds a joint appointment in the philosophy department and also in the School of Medicine. And Wendy has a long-standing interest in research ethics and integrity, dating back to her involvement to the 2007 revision of Australia's National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research. And she more recently led the 2018 revision of the same national statement. So her research relates to research ethics. That includes conceptualising vulnerability in research and the ethics of evidence-based medicine and clinical trials, as well as the ethics of surgical innovations, analysis of conflicts of interest in research, and the topic that she'll be talking about today, which is unethical transplant research. So in doing a little bit of research about Wendy, I've also discovered another feature about herself, and that is that she is extremely modest. She didn't send me any information about the various awards that she's been awarded, but she has certainly, she's been very widely recognised. So in 2019, these are some of her awards. She received the NHMRC Ethics Award, and I think what brought Wendy to my attention was her inclusion on the Nature's 10 list in 2019, which is the Nature Journal's list of the 10 people who mattered most in science in that year. And in the same year, she was also included on Medscape's 2019 list of Physicians of the Year. So it's a great pleasure to invite Wendy to talk to us today about who is responsible responding to and avoiding complicity in unethical research. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you very much for those kind words, Jennifer, and hello everyone. It's a shame we can't do this in person, but it's lovely to have you here. So as Jennifer mentioned, I'm going to be talking about unethical research and what it is and how we might deal with it and so forth. Could I have the next slide, thanks. Before I get into the talk, I just want to declare my interests. I am chair of the International Advisory Committee of the NGO International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, which is known as ETAC. And ETAC instigated the China Tribunal, which was an independent investigation into forced organ harvesting. It also commissioned the international law firm Global Rights Compliance to do a report and guidance. And I'll be referring to both of those during the talk. I don't get any money or benefits from ETAC, and I do publish research on transplant abuse as part of my academic career, academic role. Next, thanks. What I'm going to cover today is sort of breaks into 4 parts. So I'm going to talk about standard breaches in research integrity. Then I'm going to talk about ethical breaches in research and follow that with my own experience in trying to get unethical research retracted. And finally, I'm going to end on a slightly more positive note about ways that we can be careful to make sure that we ourselves don't get involved in any clinical research that raises serious, egregious breaches of ethics. Next, thanks. So first of all, standard breaches in research integrity commonly involve problems with data use, and then they're often usually described as fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, referring to what is done with the data. For example, a recent case profiled on Retraction Watch concerns the director of the National Primate Research Center in Texas. And according to the US Office for Research Integrity, he, quote, engaged in research misconduct by intentionally, knowingly, and/or recklessly falsifying and fabricating the experimental methodology. And more specifically, he falsified and fabricated the numbers for treated and untreated non-human primates in the research. And this research had been published in 2020 and is now being retracted. So that's a classic example of research misconduct involving data fabrication and falsification. And in Australia, research misconduct is regulated by the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research. This sets the standard for research integrity, and of course it's supported by various other measures such as peer reviewers, journal editors, and readers and other consumers of research who may pick up anomalies or problems and notify the relevant publisher or university, depending on who's relevant. But these mechanisms, expecting, sort of the code of conduct and the mechanisms we've got like peer review, aren't foolproof. And we do get fraudulent research entering the research ecosystem. Next, thanks. And why are we worried about this? Well, there are a number of very clear harms that occur from using fraudulent research. I'm using fraudulent to refer to research that's falsified, fabricated, or plagiarized. First of all, you get damage to the research field by wasting time and resources as other researchers follow up fraudulent leads and try to replicate falsified results. And a very recent example of this that I read in the Nature newsletter, I think just last week or the week before, concerns Alzheimer's research. There are claims that images that show images show signs of having been fabricated in dozens of influential Alzheimer's research papers, particularly ones about the amyloid theory of Alzheimer's. And the Nobel Prize winning Alzheimer researcher Thomas Sudhoff has commented, the immediate obvious damage is wasted NIH funding and wasted thinking in the field because people are using these results as a starting point for their own experiments. And other commentators were even stronger in their condemnation, saying that the whole field of Alzheimer's research has been misdirected towards the beta amyloid plaques, and it's really just lost a huge amount of time and wasted lots of resources and energy. So that's the first harm. It really damages the research field. The second is that there can be direct harms to those who rely on research results. For example, in medicine, if drug approvals are based on fraudulent research, then treatments that are harmful can be approved. And an example that you may be familiar with is, I can never say it, rofecoxib, known as Vioxx, the anti-inflammatory, which caused an unknown number of fatal and non-fatal cardiac events. And Vioxx was approved on the basis of research presented by Merck, the parent company, and they had manipulated the results to make an apparently favourable profile for their drug. So that was an example of really manipulating data to falsify results. The next problem with fraudulent research is damage to public trust. And this happens, I think, particularly when there's publicity about research fraud. And I think we've seen with COVID the dangers when people, think that that well-conducted research is on a par with research that's done very poorly. And we have seen a lot of research papers retracted with COVID research as well. So the pressure to sort of get results out there has led to a lot of retracted research to do with COVID, and I think damage to the public trust. And I think it's going to be quite hard to regain that trust in research. I think we've got quite a lot of sort of societal fragmentation, where it's going to be very hard to get people to say, okay, we've got really strong evidence for this, we should trust it. And of course, as well as in healthcare, we've got things like damage to public trust in climate change research, which again leads people to not believe that the pressures are as significant as they are, and therefore not worth acting as quickly as we need to. And finally, there can be significant harms to other people who were caught up in the research misconduct. And there was a really tragic example of this in the Netherlands some years ago. There was an educational research, very high profile educational researcher known as, I think his first name was Thomas Stapel, and he had manufactured reams and reams of research data. This was educational research, and at least 8 PhD students at the universities of Tilburg, Groningen and Amsterdam were caught up because they had based their research on his fraudulent data or aspects of it. And in one case, the fraud was detected 2 weeks before the degree was due to be confirmed. So you can just imagine the harm to that person just waiting for their PhD to be confirmed, only to find that it was based on fraudulent data and worth nothing. So these 4 harms are very closely associated with the use of fraudulent research. Next, please. And the classic way to respond to fraudulent research once it's detected is retraction. And this is primarily seen as a way of correcting the scientific record, although of course it does have a punitive element in that the person whose papers are retracted is on the public record as having engaged in research misconduct, and it may have ill effects for their career and future publications. I'll talk a little bit more about retraction and some of the problems with retraction, but I want to just turn now to problems of ethics in the research rather than fraud. Next, please. So with research misconduct and fraudulent research, we were talking about fabrication, falsification and plagiarism, which is what you do with the data. Here I'm using ethical problems with data collection to talk about problems with how the research participants themselves are treated. For example, research that doesn't secure valid informed consent is unethical, such as using patients' health data for research without telling them, or doing research which is coercive, perhaps in a very low-income country where the offer of some access to some kind of healthcare is so stark in contrast to what would otherwise be available to them that again, the research can't really be considered voluntary. Participation in the research can't be considered voluntary. So research that is unethical, may produce valid results. So it's not like fraudulent research where we've got mistakes and false and blind alleys and so forth from fraudulent research. Research that is unethical may still produce valid results. That's quite an important point to note. And of course, in Australia, it's regulated by the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research. Next, please. Because of the way that the data is collected, if the research is unethical, the harms are a bit less tangible than those 4 types of harms I outlined from using fraudulent research. But nevertheless, I think it's possible to argue that you can get some kind of moral taint. There's this idea that you can be contaminated by using unethical research, even if it's historical. And most obviously, there has been debate over using the results of research carried out during World War II, both by the Nazis and by the Japanese. I mean, these data are considered by many to be tainted due to their unethical provenance and their connection to the victims. And on this view, those who use the data risk being morally contaminated by that taint. So this might sound a bit nebulous. If we think about it a bit more, the view that data maintain a relationship to the data subject over time is really kind of foundational to our regulation of data in research ethics and to data protection legislation. We take it very seriously what happens to a person's data, and to use data in a manner that conflicts with the values of the data subject is recognised as a form of data harm. And these concerns can persist even when the data subject is dead. And this view that the connection between the person and their data is morally significant and enduring is reflected in regulatory and governance mechanisms. So what I'm proposing here is that using data from research that was unethical in whatever way, usually because of lack of consent or egregious harms to the alleged participants, by using their data, that does constitute a harm to that person. And if it's known that that research was unethical and the person then persists in using it, then that really becomes a morally blameworthy form of complicity, because you're compounding that harm by continuing to use the data, even if you knew it was secured unethically. I can have the next slide, please. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. So there is a strong presumption against using research that's known to be unethical, and as I've said, I think it can morally taint the person that's using it and perhaps be a form of blameworthy complicity. And there are other arguments against using research known to be unethical. So these include things like, by using it, you're providing an implicit validation of the research, and it thereby kind of affords a kind of a veneer of respectability to the researchers who did that unethical research. It can be seen as a breach of public trust. If it's known that you're using research that was procured unethically, they think, well, what else are they doing that we haven't known about? And that can undermine people's willingness to participate in research in the future. If you use unethical research, it fails to deter people from doing more unethical research. Then nothing really happened. They still used the research. We got our results out there. Another argument against using it is that it can fail to demonstrate proper respect to the victim and it failing to protest the wrong. So if you refuse to use the data and refuse to engage with that research, it's really saying, we're pretty horrified by what happened and we want to make that horror known on the record. And then I've already mentioned the moral complicity. So that's a fairly compelling list of reasons for not using research known to be unethical. But as well as that, there are some arguments for using it. And here we sort of get into fairly controversial terrain. But there's, sometimes people say if the perceived value of the research in terms of knowledge gain is extraordinary and you couldn't get that knowledge by any other way, and the research is valid and will save lives, then some people argue that you should use the research. But there's ambivalence about this in the scientific community. So, for example, there's an anatomical atlas called the Pernkopf Atlas, and it's based on the dissection of World War II Jewish victims. And apparently it is an astonishing, the degree of accuracy is astonishing, and surgeons have been known to ask specifically to use this atlas when they're doing particularly tricky surgery. And there's debate even within the Jewish community about whether or not it's permissible to use that, and there are kind of various guidelines for when it's okay to use it, and it has to be a very unique circumstance. But that was certainly unethical research that underpinned his atlas. And more recently, there's ongoing debate about the publication of data from Dr. Zhang He's unethical and illegal gene editing experiments in China a few years ago. And this debate has recently resurfaced because his data has now been published in a new book by a cardiologist called Musunuru at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's justified publication on the grounds of public interest in access to the knowledge, this idea that, well, we can't get this information any other way and it's important for it to be in the public domain. this same person, Mansunuru, has argued somewhat perplexingly that the ethical flaws in his work prevent its publication in mainstream peer-reviewed journals, but instead we should publish it in non-traditional formats. I can't really make sense of that, because basically he's wanting the information in the public domain, and to argue that publishing it in a book instead of in a peer-reviewed journal, I think, is kind of splitting hairs in an unhelpful way. And I think one other point I just want to mention here is that the Committee on Publication Ethics, known as COPE, has guidelines for journal editors on how to deal with research misconduct and unethical research. And they now formally include unethical research as a reason for retraction since 2019. So now I'm going to turn to retraction, because despite our best regulatory and review processes, unethical and/or fraudulent research does get published, and once discovered, the accepted response is retraction. So I could have the next slide, please. So in late 2016, some colleagues and I called for retraction of a transplantation research paper on the grounds it violated international ethical norms about procuring organs from executed prisoners. And that's a snapshot of the title page of the journal article, a multi-author article from a centre in China, and the lead author was someone called Yu. And the article claimed that of the 564 liver transplants reported in the research, not a single one was obtained from an executed prisoner. And this is important because taking organs from executed prisoners violates various international ethical norms. Next, please. So these norms come from the WHO, from the Transplant Society, from the World Medical Association, and from the Declaration of Istanbul Custodian Group, and they all are opposed to or prohibit the recovery and/or transplantation of organs from prisoners who are on death row or have been executed. Next, please. At the time when we did our research, and dating back some years, the Transplant Society had actually put a prohibition on presenting or publishing research involving patient data or samples from recipients of organs or tissues that had their origin in executed prisoners. So the TTS came out quite strongly early on this very issue of not publishing research from involving organs from executed prisoners. Next, please. But we had evidence that claim that all of the liver transplants were obtained ethically, not from executed prisoners, was not true. The claim wasn't compatible with what was known about the Chinese organ procurement process during the time of the study, because during the time of the study, more than 90% of all organs in China were procured from executed prisoners. Next, please. So the retraction was a very protracted process. So we read the paper with concern. We sent a letter to the editor, which I call letter 1, and the editor accepted this for publication. As is right and proper, he contacted the authors for a response, and the authors duly responded. He then, Mario Mondello is the editor's name, he then gave us the chance to respond to that letter from the authors. Well, the authors had made, in my view, a couple of significant problems with their response. First of all, they hadn't presented any new evidence that rebutted the evidence that we'd put in our letter. And second of all, they made some new claims which were also false and demonstrably false. So we wrote a letter responding to, which I call letter 2, responding to the author's response. And in that letter, we weren't sure how this was all going to play out, so we crafted that letter very carefully to present all of the evidence, and we wrote it in a way of sort of point from the authors our response, so that the material content of the author's letter was included in our letter 2. The authors were then asked to respond to letter 2, but they failed to agree by an agreed deadline. They failed to respond by an agreed deadline, which was a generous deadline. and therefore the editor agreed on retraction of the paper. And then we entered this very strange kind of limbo for some weeks, and nothing was happening. And I was emailing Mario to say what's going on, what's happening, when is this all going to be published? And it turned out that the publisher, Wiley, was very concerned about this whole process. They were concerned about our letters and the retraction. And I've got no reason for this was ever given, but we did note that the publisher Wiley has an extensive catalogue of Chinese language journals, and we did wonder whether they were concerned about upsetting their Chinese clientele. Anyway, eventually this was published. There was an editor's note, there was a publisher's note, there was a retraction notice, and there were both of our letters. There was not the letter from the authors because they declined to provide consent for that letter to be published. Next, please. That's the notice. And what we were, I guess, encouraged to see was that the retraction notice specifically said that the paper was being retracted for breaching international organ donation ethical standards. So it wasn't retracted for research misconduct in terms of data fraud, but it was retracted for breaching ethical standards. Next, please. So having had success with that one retraction, we then felt that there were probably a lot of other papers, Chinese transplant papers published in English language journals, that also breached these ethical standards about using transplant organs procured from executed prisoners. So we designed a scoping review to investigate that question specifically. We looking for any biological material from executed prisoners, for any evidence of institutional review board or ethics committee approval, and for consent. Next, please. So we ended up, this was a long process with a largely volunteer team, and in 2019 our scoping review was published in BMJ Open, and it's probably got the best altimetric score I've ever had. It caused quite a lot of, it attracted quite a lot of attention when it came out, as indeed the first retraction had. Next, please. So the results of that we found were 445 papers that reported transplants, and all of the papers included data from before 2015. Why is that date important? Well, in 2015, the Chinese declared that they would no longer use organs from executed prisoners in their transplant. They claimed that from January 2015, all organs would be procured from volunteers. It's not clear that goal has been achieved, and other colleagues have done work on that. But certainly all of the papers included pre-2015 data when 90% of the organs came from executed prisoners. So clearly there were organs from executed prisoners there. 73% of the papers claimed that research ethics approval was gained, often using a very formulaic statement, such as the research was performed in accordance with the Declaration of Helsinki. We saw very few papers where there was an ethics committee number and an ethics committee date of approval and the name of an ethics committee. 7% of the papers made the explicit claim that no organs from prisoners were used. So that was 37% of the 445, was 33 papers. And we looked at these papers very, very closely, and we were able to show that 19 of them, that was clearly a false claim. The remainder, we couldn't prove that the claims were false, but there was good prima facie evidence that it was, just because of the timelines. And only 1% of the papers claimed that the donors had given consent. So clearly a very, very small number out of the 85,000 transplants. Next, please. So on the basis of the scoping review, journals have now retracted or flagged more than 40 papers. And this is without a campaign, because we haven't had the resources to write to all of the journal editors involved and alert them to the concerns about their papers. So this is a kind of like an organic set of retractions that have grown from that paper. Next, please. And it's not just transplant papers that are a concern. So I've been since 2019, I've been in contact with Professor Yves Moreau at the University of Leuven in Belgium. So Yves a bioinformatician who works in genetics research, and he's got a particular interest in genetics forensics research. So after we had a chat over Zoom and so forth, he decided to have a look at the genetics forensic research. And he found that 50% of the studies published between 2011 and 2018 had a co-author from the military, police or judiciary. And this immediately rang alarm bells for him, and he did some number crunching with those papers. And he found that Tibetans were over 40 times more frequently studied than China's ethnic Han majority, and likewise the Uyghurs were 30 times more intensely studied than the Han. And he drilled down a bit further into his data and noted that 3 leading forensic genetics journals published by Springer Nature and Elsevier have published 40 articles co-authored by members of the Chinese police that describe the DNA profiling of Tibetans and Muslim minorities. And these, I'm not a database expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I understand that these databases are available and international researchers are using them. And he felt that clearly informed consent for people who gave their genetic material was extremely unlikely given the presence of police and military people on the authorial team, and also what we know about the repression of minorities such as Tibetans and Uyghurs in China. Next, please. And what's interesting is that, Eve had a similar experience in a way to us in trying to get retraction. So far, one paper in human genetics has been retracted, and he raised concerns about the paper in June 2020, and he actually appealed to the journal's editorial board, citing the Hippocratic Oath. He was very concerned about public trust in human genetics, and that people doing genetics research needed to be very clear, very transparent about how they were doing that research, and that it was done in ethical ways. And he felt that if the human genetics research community was perceived to be condoning or even tolerating human rights abuses, then the public trust in genetics would rapidly crumble. And he was very worried about that. And he also felt, given the time that it took for any response from human genetics and the kind of slowness of the retraction in a way, that his inquiries were being stonewalled because of the strategic and business considerations by publishers who are afraid of poking a mighty bear, and who's referring to the financial interests of journals operating in China. So that was our suspicion as well, with the publishers' reluctance to get behind the retraction of the Liver International paper. But again, I mean, I don't think Eve, just as with us, we didn't have any definite proof of that. It just seemed to be the only way to explain why the publishers wouldn't want to act on a retraction. Next, please. Okay, so retractions, it's very hard to get retractions, but once you've got a paper retracted, it's still a problematic way of dealing with unethical research and with research fraud, because there's no consistent system or process for identifying retracted articles across multiple platforms. And I've checked with some papers that I know have been retracted, and when you look them up on some platforms, they're clearly marked as retracted, and when you look on other ones, they're not. So you might get a paper that's been retracted, but you retrieve it from a platform that doesn't actually tell you it's been retracted. Retracted articles continue to be cited because although they've got retracted written across them, you can still get hold of them. And there are no mechanisms for excluding or extracting retracted articles from secondary uses such as systematic reviews or meta-analyses. So once that data's out there, whether it's unethical or fraudulent, it's very sticky in terms of trying to get it back. It's really hard to get it out. And there's no comprehensive public database. Retraction Watch does a terrific job, but they're run on a shoestring, and their database is not easy to use, I have to say. It's pretty clunky, and they rely on a lot of volunteer labour, I think, to keep going. Next, please. The last part, I'm just going to quickly mention steps that we can take in Australia to make sure that we're not complicit in unethical research. Because I think it's fairly straightforward that there is a moral duty to avoid complicity if we're fairly confident that there are ethical breaches, particularly where these amount to human rights abuses. And two of the known areas are, of course, transplant research and genetic research in the People's Republic of China. So to look specifically into this issue, ETAC commissioned an international human rights legal firm based in London called Global Rights Compliance, who specialise in looking at ways to ensure that there are no ethical breaches in supply chains in particular. But they took this work on, I think it was the first time they'd worked in this sector. So they prepared two reports which are publicly available on their website and on the ETAC website. One is a legal advisory report, and others actually got guidelines on how to avoid complicity in unethical research. And I'll just talk through very briefly how to do that. So next, please. So they recommend doing what they call human rights due diligence. So the first is to identify and assess the human rights risks, and then to prevent, mitigate or remediate those to the extent possible and monitor them, and to disengage if it's not possible to remediate them and monitor them. So next, please. So for clinical research, in the documents that I've mentioned, they lay out a series of questions to consider. So if you're engaged in research, if you want to engage in transplant research, if you want to engage in genetics research, I think if you want to engage in obstetrics research with Chinese colleagues, given what we know about some of the obstetric interventions with Uyghur women, these are areas where you would be worried and really want to look at your due diligence. So the questions would be things like, have your potential collaborators provided sufficient information on free, voluntary and informed consent for trial participants? In organ research, have they provided evidence that the organs used in previous research project were acquired ethically? And then you might need to think about what you would accept as evidence there. There are a number of red flags that are identified in these documents. For example, if the proposed collaborators are based in a country that's reported to receive a high number of transplant tourists, or if it's based in a country that lacks adequate levels of transparency with regard to its own organ transplantation and donation system. So the research in these documents is specific to organ donation and transplantation, but it's not that difficult to work out how you would apply it in these other areas, particularly forensic research and obstetric research. And then they recommend that you can try and remedy or mitigate. If you do have concerns, you can communicate these and request corrective measures or modify the agreements. But the bottom line is, if it's clear that your concerns can't be met, then either terminate the agreement if it's already existing, or simply fail to enter it. And there was an example of this given to the China Tribunal in 2018 by Professor James Shapiro, who's director of the clinical islet transplant program at the University of Alberta. And he was asked to collaborate to set up a clinical islet transplant program in China at the Zhejiang University 4th Affiliated Hospital. And this program would have used islet cells from donated pancreas. And he was unable to secure assurances that all donor organs in the program would be sourced in an ethical way, and he therefore just refused to collaborate. So this was a bit of a flagship collaboration between his university and the Chinese collaborators, and I think he was challenged, but he stuck to his guns and said that if they can't provide assurances that the organs are going to be ethically procured, then I'm just not going to engage. And he didn't. Next, please. So to finish off, I guess my take-home messages are that breaches of both research integrity and research ethics warrant retraction if the research has been published. But retractions are hard to secure, and they're a very imperfect mechanism for correcting the scientific record. And so, prevention, I guess, is better than cure. And in areas of clinical research, if you're contemplating clinical research with international partners, and you've got concerns about human rights abuses in those countries, if there are various red flags, then it's really important to do your human rights due diligence, and that can help avoid complicity. It won't necessarily stop what's happening in that other country. We don't have control over, what other people do, but we can make sure that we don't support it in any way. And certainly, it has been the case. I'm not sure if it's so much the case now, but it has been the case in the past that it's been a real mark of prestige for Chinese universities to get Western collaborators. And if that is cut off in the area of transplant research in particular, if people refuse to collaborate with China and refuse to engage with them, then this really sends a strong message. And in fact, since we've published that guidance, or since Global Rights Compliance have published their guidance, I think it's the International Journal of Heart and Lung Transplantation has now adopted the policy of not accepting any papers on transplantation from China that involve organs that have been retrieved from donors, just because they cannot be confident that the organs were sourced ethically. And so that, again, that was part of the guidance for journal editors, was to really, to do your due diligence, and if you can't be confident that human rights abuses aren't involved in the, the supply chain for research, if we can call it that, then it's better just to back right out and say, no, we're just not going to accept it. Thank you. Stop sharing.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. That was amazing, really amazing talk. Now, I'm obviously keen to hear questions from the many people who are here. So if people would like to ask a question, hang on, I'm just looking at the chat. I think there are a couple. Look, Adrian, would you like to, we might just go in order. Adrian, do you want to actually ask your question by jumping off mute?
Sure, yeah, look, that was really interesting, and thank you for doing this important work. I mean, it's a very hypothetical situation. It's not one I've faced, but it just made me think, what if there was a really dubious trial that had very interesting results, and maybe somebody wanted to repeat it here in Australia, where obviously everything would be done legitimately? I know we shouldn't be using these trials in systematic reviews, but is that a situation where we could use one of these trials?
What do you mean by dubious? Do you mean ethically problematic or fraudulent?
Well, fraudulent, you wouldn't trust the results. I think maybe you could potentially trust the results, but yeah, the kind of examples you were talking about where, maybe the livers have been taken from prisoners, or.
Yeah, so more use the research question and do your own research to investigate that question. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Look, it's really hard to trace the genealogy of ideas, isn't it? So, I mean, there's nothing new under the sun. I guess it would depend a little bit on how you came to hear about it. If it was already published, if it had kind of got through the ethical and review screens and was already published, and you didn't want to use their results or trust their results, but felt that it was an important, they'd perhaps given an insight into a way of investigating a problem that you hadn't thought about. Look, I don't think that's certainly not as problematic as using the research itself, just using the idea, but it's a good question, yeah.
Thanks, Adrian. Amanda, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. I was glued to it. So you mentioned that there was a reluctance to retract papers. Could you tell us a bit more about the process of gathering that evidence to make sure it was really watertight, so that you could demonstrate to the editors that the livers were obtained from prisoners?
Yes, it was a complicated process. So there's a team of, I think, 6 or 7 of us. Some were volunteers, a couple of us were academics. We had one person who spoke Chinese and could read Mandarin on the team, which was invaluable. So we went through all of the papers, we extracted the text around the ethics approval, around the source of the organs, around the donors. And then we looked at particularly those 33 ones where they claimed that no data was used at all from prisoners. And we looked at the hospitals where those had taken place. We looked at what the information that had been published previously about organ harvesting at those hospitals. We looked to see whether there was any evidence that there were any volunteer programs at that hospital. And here's where Matthew Robertson's Chinese language skills came in, because there was a volunteer scheme to be part of, there was a pilot scheme for volunteer donors that started in 2010, and this is where we were able to trip up the writers of the authors of the first paper, because they claimed that their hospital had been approved in this pilot study, and that and so that their organs were from volunteers because they were part of the pilot. Well, Matthew was able to dig down into the hospital website in Chinese, right down, quite a few layers down, and he found that their hospital had indeed been approved for the volunteer pilot program, but for hearts, not for livers. So we were then able to say, okay, well, this is clearly what they've said is not true. And Matthew was able to provide a translation of the information he'd found. So it was that kind of level. It was a real, it was kind of like a detective process in a way. There was a lot of detailed evidence that we had to look at. And we presented this to Mario Mondello. That was in the second letter in particular. We said, well, look, they've made this claim, and this claim's clearly false. And he accepted our evidence, particularly because the Chinese authors did not offer any evidence at all. They just made assertions, but they didn't try and even provide any documentation or anything. They just claimed that we were not telling the truth, and that they were, but without any evidence. And so Mario went in favour of evidence. But then it did get I think it got pretty tense with the publishers, to the point that he actually threatened to resign if the retraction and the publication of our letters didn't go ahead. So I was kind of amazed by how willing he was to stand up for that. But he was genuinely distraught that his journal had published this article, given that the organs had come from executed prisoners.
If anyone else has a question, please feel free to put your hand up and I'll call on you. Yep, I'm just going to see who that is. Wendy, I might just sneak in a question of my own. Oh, I can see Brent's going to ask a question. Brent, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Wendy. That was a fantastic talk. I was just wondering if you could sort of, I don't know, expand upon a little more of the idea of that there's implicit approval in the use of unethical research data, because I don't know, reading and watching your slides, the message seems to be that an ounce of prevention is sort of better than a pound of cure. And given that sort of information has a quality of asymmetry, that it's easy to transmit things, but very hard to block them, very hard to censor them or retract them. You know, is it useful to regard it as implicit approval? Because it just seems a bit like a genetic fallacy. Yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I mean, certainly, that I agree very much. There is an asymmetry. Once the information's out there, it's almost impossible to get it back. And I think there is a tension between the value that people place on the knowledge versus the ethical breach. And I think we're seeing that played out with the publication of He's research in that book.
But sometimes not, which is pretty normal.
Oh, I think we've got some. Maybe someone can mute. Put their mute on. Thanks. Yeah. So that seems. So there is that tension there between people who think that the knowledge doesn't matter how the knowledge is gained. If the knowledge is valuable, then we should just use it. and that is a tension. I think that does lead us towards, as you say, a presumption to publish. But you know, there are dangers in publication, and I think giving people there's the harms to the victims, because it does seem to imply that, well, you know, it's a very instrumental way of thinking about people, that it doesn't really matter what happened to you. We've got this knowledge, and this knowledge is valuable, so we're going to use it. And that doesn't seem right to me. It kind of flies in the face of research ethics, which aims to maintain the dignity of participants and to ensure they're fully informed consent and so forth. So that presumption to, you know, against using unethical research, I think is very strong. I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
Yeah, I think fairly well. It's it is a quandary. And
there's a lot written about that, particularly by the affected communities, particularly by the Jewish community, about using the Nazi research. I think that there's a lot of interesting debate there. I mean, in a paper that I'm a co-author on, led by someone called Wendy Higgins, which was in the references, we actually argue that the Chinese transplant research that is based on using organs from executed prisoners is probably, as well as being unethical, it's probably not robust research, because the ways in which the prisoners are killed and so forth is nothing like the way that donors in the West die. Donors in the West die of natural causes, be they trauma or disease or whatever, rather than execution. So the ischemic times are really different. The health of the person before they die is different, and so forth. So we actually argue that, as well as being unethical, the Chinese transplant research is unlikely to have that compelling argument that it's really valuable information that you wouldn't be able to get from anywhere else.
Thanks, Wendy. Could I just ask people to stay on mute if they're not asking questions? I think I've got a question here in the chat. So is there any positive evidence that any of the organ harvesting studies conducted in China are based on fabricated data rather than organ harvesting from executed prisoners?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Thanks.
No,
Thanks, Wendy. Look, I might just jump in with one question, Wendy. I have a question about, I guess, journal editors themselves. I know that there's discussion in the sort of scientific community about the importance of having, you know, international representation on transplant journals. And I was wondering the approach, for example, to transplant journals, including editors from countries that might be susceptible to unethical transplantation research itself, you know, countries, for example, with the death penalty and other features.
Yeah, there's a tension there, and I think we've seen the Transplantation Society kind of swing both ways on this. So in 2006, they had a specific policy about China, because China was known to be using organs from executed prisoners, and it was openly admitted at that point in 2006. And that's when concerns about forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience first arose. So the TTS was very strong that they wouldn't accept any papers from China at that time that involved organs from executed prisoners. And given there was no other source, that was an effective ban on all Chinese research. And then over the subsequent decade, they became more confident. In my view, that was a false confidence that organs were being ethically procured, particularly from 2010, when the pilot volunteer program was allegedly started. And so, but they were still, you know, kind of trying to be careful. So they were pretty horrified when their journal came up with 6 papers from our study, and they were, I have to say, they retracted them very smartly, and they put this down just to sort of human error, rather than they hadn't changed their policy. It was sort of human error. But I mentioned the International Journal of Heart and Lung Transplantation is the only journal that I'm aware of that has actually now, just this year, put out a statement saying that they will not accept any papers. And I think that's because of there's an Israeli heart transplant surgeon called Jacob Levy who's been very active on this. He first became alerted to the problem when a patient of his said, "I'm going to China to get a heart transplant in 2 weeks." And he said, well, how on earth can you know that? And they said, they've told me the day I'll get my transplant. And he realized that it must be someone being killed on that day, because you couldn't predict a donor on a particular day. You wouldn't. And he's done a lot of work. And most recently, he's worked with Matt Robertson, who was an author on the Scoping Review, who's a Chinese language speaker. And they have just published a paper in Transplantation, basically showing evidence that it is the doctors themselves who are killing, the patients are being killed by explantation. They're not executed prisoners. They are prisoners who are killed by explantation of their organs. So it's clearly showing that doctors are involved in this. And I think that was the kind of the final piece of evidence for that international journal. And they've now just said, we just can't run the risk of any organ transplantation research from China, because there is no way of us guaranteeing that doctors weren't involved in killing the person to get those organs.
Goodness me. That's a
Yeah.
very... Now, I can see, Ying, you've got a question. I think we've just got a couple of minutes, so we've probably got time to squeeze in something quick. Ying, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, Macquarie University, just in last year, December, and Sunday Morning Herald published an article regarding the Macquarie University 40 article, problem with the 40 article, and what happened with that case?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know. I've only been looking at transplant research, particularly concerned with organs from executed prisoners. So I don't look at any other retractions, so I'm not able to comment on that. But I know that research misconduct is prevalent across the world. It's certainly not limited to any particular group of researchers. And I think Retraction Watch shows that. And the example I gave of the Alzheimer's research and the primate research, there's certainly a lot of fraudulent research, and I thoroughly agree with it being retracted.
Because it's right happening in the Macquarie University, which you are, working in the University of the Macquarie University. So that's why I said, well, this is quite a while. I recently asked someone. I said,
"Yes,
what happened?"
I understand, Jing, but I think Professor Rogers is not aware. She's not involved in that research. So, look, we might just move on quickly. We've got one more question in the chat from Jane Hardy, who's just talking about whether there are other journals that are considering to take blanket bans around publishing papers from particular journals.
I don't know at the moment, but that the advice from Global Rights Compliance only came out in April this year, and so we're still we're in a process, or ETAC's in a process of trying to make people familiar with that, because I think up until we had that advice from that law firm, it was hard for people to know what to do. Whereas now they've set out some very clear steps that these are the things that you can do if you're at all worried. And the guidance is specific to transplant research, but as I said, you can look at other areas of research and see how the questions would apply. And I understand that the Uyghur community is now commissioning Global Rights Compliance to do a similar guidance for them on obstetric research, given allegations of forced sterilizations and so forth. So I think that's been a really positive move, getting that guidance, and we're hoping that other journals will hear about what the International Journal of Heart and Lung Transplantation has done and perhaps consider following their lead.
Thank you. Look, I'm looking at the time. We're just over the hour, so I'd just like to thank you, Wendy, very, very much for an extremely thought-provoking talk. I think and I think I'm speaking for everybody here in our admiration for what you and your team are doing. I think it's such an important issue, a very difficult topic, a very important topic, and it's just been an absolute pleasure to hear you today. So thank you so much. Thank you too for everybody who've attended and who asked some really interesting questions. And yes, look, maybe we'll ask you to come back again and talk about some other research ethics issues, because I think it does highlight that the distinction between integrity and ethics, we don't always think about that. And certainly for a biobank that's here to promote research into biospecimens, derived from humans, these kinds of questions are really important.
Yeah. Thank you, Jennifer, and thanks for the opportunity and for the questions.
A pleasure. Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.